terrestrial radio was still actually allowed to play any music they wanted without permission. You cannot hold your music back from terrestrial radio in this country. And there's no obligation for them to pay the sound recording copyright owners, so the artists and the labels.
Once in a while on Sound Connections, we have specific topics that are hard to understand. We try to deep dive into them so we can learn something about the entrepreneurial opportunities in the music industry. With Linda, we're going to talk about performance rights and a lot of the things in the industry that just doesn't make sense. Linda, welcome to Sound Connections podcast.
Thank you, Jacob. It's so great to be here.
I'm lucky to have you here. You are a person who knows a lot about a lot of stuff within the music industry. But today we're going to talk about neighboring rights and sort of associated relevant things to know about that. But Linda, I met you at a conference because you were chosen to be one of the clever people who knew a lot about a lot of stuff. Could you just walk me through what have you done and why are you so knowledgeable?
That is a lot of pressure, Jacob, to be clever about a lot of stuff. And I really am grateful to be here. It was such a pleasure to meet you at a conference in Europe about a month ago. So it was coming up on our anniversary here. So, Jacob, I started my career in the music industry on Capitol Hill here in the United States, which is where the laws are written, which was a very fascinating place to be in the late 90s, early aughts, when the digital transformation was happening for everybody, for every context of the world, particularly for the entertainment industry. So I had this wonderful front row seat to all of the issues that were in play, the laws that had to be in place to allow that digital transformation to happen, and got to hear from every aspect of the entertainment industry, whether it be video or film or photography or authors that would come up to Capitol Hill and want to weigh in on what that legislation needed to contain to protect the copyrights and intellectual property of creators. So that's where I really kind of started to cut my teeth on a lot of these issues as a part of that bill here in the United States. It's called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act here in the United States. As part of that, there was really an update to how royalties were going to be collected and distributed in the digital age. As part of that bill, they actually created a collective, a public rights organization, a performing rights organization, they created a performing rights organization that was able to, for the first time, collect and distribute digital royalties for the sound recording performance right. So that had never been done here at all. The terrestrial radio here in the States and other performance doesn't pay on the sound recording half of the copyright. And so the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, among many other things that allowed Steve Jobs to create iPods and iPads and then iPhones, it also allowed for the creation of a collection organization that was able to kind of participate in these digital royalties that later became SoundExchange, as it's been known around the world for the last 20 years. But the irony of my career is that I started on Capitol Hill kind of writing the law that actually created, so to speak, SoundExchange. So from there, I left Capitol Hill in 2003 to actually go work for Universal Music and Universal Pictures. It was one company at the time, and worked on the whole overarching umbrella of all of their intellectual property rights. Until I got a call in 2005 from the CEO of the newly acquired Warner Music Group. There are three major labels here in the United States, around the world: Sony Music, Warner Music, and Universal. And Warner Music had just been acquired by a gentleman and some investors. His name was Edgar Bronfman Jr., and he had bought the company in 2005 from Time Warner and started it as its own standalone music label, and asked me to please consider running his Washington, D.C. office for the new company, which was a fantastic time. It was right at the heart of all these technologies coming online. The Grokster case had hit the Supreme Court here in the United States. So it was a very exciting time for intellectual property rights holders and what was going to be their future in the digital age. I ran that office for the whole time that Edgar Bronfman was CEO, for about 6 years, and then jumped back to the video side, worked for Time Warner for 2 years after that. At that point, it was just the video properties of Time Warner and their magazines as well. After that, while I was there and working for this incredible Fortune 50 company, which was an amazing experience. I always tell people I felt like I got an MBA for free while I was working for the industry. It really hit me, though, that the creators, the actual creators, the writers, the drummers, the painters, the screenplay writers, they all, were having a voice here in Washington, D.C., but in my opinion, at the time, it needed to be amplified. So I walked into Time Warner one day. I thanked them for the opportunity and told them I was going to go start my own business to do two things, to help artists and creators and to teach. I really wanted to teach. So those were the two reasons that took me out of the corporate world after representing them here in Washington for about 20 years. And then started my own company called LBB Creative Strategies. The very first day that I had started that company, the first client on my doorstep was SoundExchange. So they said, we represent creators. You want to represent creators. This is a perfect match. Come on and work for us and help represent creators. And that was the irony of my career, is I'd kind of written this bill that created this incredible organization that was out there collecting money for creators. And then I got to go work there. I consulted with my company for about a year and then went in-house and did industry relations for SoundExchange for 8 years, and then went back to the government affairs side for about 2. So by the time I left SoundExchange this past spring, I left as the senior VP of public policy and government relations. But I had spent the better part of 10 years working for the company, doing industry relations and just really communicating the word of what a PRO does, what a collective rights organization does for people around the world.
Wow.
And that takes me today. So I left in July. I left SoundExchange in July because that other half of what I wanted to do, I had been teaching as an adjunct for about 10 years. And then when the opportunity came for me to help run American University's business and entertainment program, I definitely jumped in the deep end of the pool, became a full-time faculty member. I'm helping the founder of that program, John Simpson, who, by the way, was also the first CEO of SoundExchange, now runs that program at AU, and invited me to come and be his assistant and teach full-time starting this past August. So now in the academic world, which was wonderful because of one of many things. It took me to the wonderful conference I met you at in Kristiansand, Norway. And I'm now getting to work with the next generation of leaders in the entertainment industry, which is really an incredible pivotal point of my career. I am just loving kind of spending time with young minds and hearing their ideas and helping them kind of navigate the waters of the entertainment industry they're entering here in 2023.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. One of the things, even though I'm young myself, is also how can we help the next generation of the music industry and entrepreneurs, especially because the music industry, historically speaking, has maybe not been the greatest industry to be in many ways, especially when it comes to, what SoundExchange is representing, people getting paid for that aspect. Before we go into all of this, could you just help me on a basic level understand what is performance rights? What is terrestrial radio? What is all the things that SoundExchange worked with that you helped create the bill for? What are those?
Sure. Well, as you know, there's the two sides of the Copyright Act. So you've got the composition piece, and then you have the sound recording piece, both of which need to be you need a collective organization to make sure that everybody who owns those rights are getting paid. It would be certainly nice if you could walk into a bar and recognize every single writer and performer that are on a track that happens to be on the background in that bar that you're enjoying, but you might not even know you're enjoying it because it's kind of that's really, really difficult for anybody to manage. And that became apparent even back when we were just talking about live music, when we weren't even talking about recorded music. Performance rights have been around from the mid 1800s in France is where they started. So that recognition that you need a performance rights organization to help pay the right people to keep all of those records, to let people do their business legitimately and engage in the commerce, but make it as easy as possible. So performance rights exist, at least I'll speak primarily from the United States, which is the law I'm most familiar with, for both the writers of tracks and the performers of tracks. One piece that's very important, particularly here in the United States, but it's a global issue, and I'm sure we'll get into it. One place that music is performed quite readily is terrestrial radio. So what is terrestrial radio? It's AM, FM radio. It's over the airwaves. It's traditionally the way people have discovered and listened to music up before the digital age. So we've got terrestrial radio, and now, of course, you've got non-interactive radio. You've got internet radio, which is another big way that people consume music, and then all of the interactive services that people enjoy. Performance rights comes when music is being performed for a large audience, whether it be in the radio, whether it be in a stadium or a restaurant, bar, mall, hotel, any kind of public performance triggers that part of the Copyright Act. So if your song is being performed for other people to hear it when you might not know about that, you are, as a copyright owner, whether you be the writer, and in some cases, the sound recording copyright owner, you're entitled to your royalties. So specifically, I did the bulk of my career, as I said, was spent on the sound recording side of copyright law here in the United States. The sound recording copyright owners get paid in the United States only when their music is played on digital radio. So any digital transmission, this was part of that DMCA bill that we wrote back in the late 90s, is when royalty owners can get paid. If there's a digital transmission, a digital performance, you are entitled to a performance right. And you need these collective rights, these collective management organizations to help count and account for that and keep track of not only everything that's being played, but what needs to be paid out. Obviously, there's more broad public performance rights here in the United States that are, like I said, for bars, restaurants, any type of malls, any type of external way to enjoy it. Typically, the writers they get paid for that. The sound recording copyright owners do not. But there are, as you know, 4 major PROs here in the United States that do the bulk of that collection for the writers and thus their publishers as well.
Why is it? Because I right now live in Norway, and it's not just terrestrial, digital radio that is, getting neighboring rights or this rights payment. It's also terrestrial radio. Why is it in America, which is such a big market, that terrestrial radio does not pay this out?
You've just struck the center point of my entire career, Jacob. Is actually, I've been fighting for creators, whether they be on the label side, the individual side, to actually change that law here in the United States. People often ask me why I'm headquartered in Washington, D.C. if I work for a music company or the music industry, because it's not really the music capital of the world. It's because on Capitol Hill, there are many issues, as was the case with the DMCA, as was later the case with its successor, the Music Modernization Act in 2018. One piece of legislation that has not been successful, both on the DMCA and in the Music Modernization Act, and in every other iteration that the bill has been in for the last really kind of 50 years that we've been fighting for this, is the terrestrial performance. So it's the answer to your question is really precedent in history. So back in the day when artists would go to have their music played on the radio, before we had these round pieces of plastic that were recordings, they would walk into a radio station, they would sing their song or two on a Saturday night, the radio station would broadcast it, and they'd give the artist and maybe the band, a couple $100. They would go home. That was it. Then in the 50s and 60s, radio stations started using recorded music to blast over their airwaves. And that model never changed. One thing that has always been constant here with terrestrial radio is that writers get paid. So, and the thinking back in the day when we had those live performances was you couldn't identify the writer. You could hear the singer, but you couldn't identify the writer. So writers have always gotten paid for terrestrial radio in this country, but the performers did not. The thinking back, that the excuse, so to speak, that radio would give was you're getting promotion for your music. We're promoting your music, we're promoting you, and people will go down to the record store and buy a record, and it all comes out in the wash. And so for those years that was actually happening, that there wasn't a whole lot of recognition of this problem. But when the digital transition happened and people stopped going to record stores and buying round pieces of plastic, the laws never changed. And terrestrial radio was still allowed to play any music they wanted without permission. You cannot hold your music back from terrestrial radio in this country. And there's no obligation for them to pay the sound recording copyright owners, so the artists and the labels. So there have been many, many attempts. And like I said, Jacob, it's kind of been what I've spent the bulk of my career. If I look at one kind of central theme throughout, this piece of it has been what I've been fighting for, because it does exist around the world. The sound recording copyright owners get paid in every country in the developed world. The notable exceptions are like North Korea. And it was China, but China actually now has even better copyright laws for sound recording performances than the United States does. So that has changed, and everything around the world, every country around the world is paying for this, but the United States is not. Like you said, in Norway, in Europe, across Europe, when music is played on the radio, artists are paid for that. And we would like that to be the case here in the United States, but that is one piece that SoundExchange did not collect on. So SoundExchange's core business that they were currently collecting on and are currently collecting on is the non-interactive satellite and webcasted radio. So it's that piece of it, not the terrestrial radio.
To ask you a more broader question, that's a really interesting answer, by the way, is for entrepreneurs or people who's in the music industry who wants to be entrepreneurial that's listening to this podcast, they need to adhere to certain regulations and laws about the industry and how you can monetize on music. The process of not getting something through those two acts seems to be a result of lobbying. Could you walk me through what happens in the different ends of the spectra of trying to say, this is fair, this needs to happen, and this is like, and then there's a separate party saying, no, we don't want that to happen. What is happening in that dynamic?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think this is true around the world. And anytime you want to get something done, it's easier to stop something than to get something. So in this example, the sound recording copyright owners would like to have the royalties for digital. Sorry, I'm going to start that over. The sound recording copyright owners would like to have royalties when their music is played on the radio for free. They believe that they deserve to get paid. So they form a coalition. They find friends that agree with that. Here in the United States, the coalition was called the Music First Coalition. It was comprised of unions and record labels and artists and the Grammy organization, every kind of creative organization under the sun created that coalition. They band together, they write a bill, they take it to the legislators and say, we would like to pass this bill. The people that would be affected that would ultimately have to pay those royalties, i.e. the radio industry, the radio broadcasting industry, says, we don't want that bill to happen. We like things the way we are. They've had, like I said, over the years, some arguments about promotion. I would argue that just because something's getting promoted doesn't mean that you're not entitled to get paid for it. But those, the opponents to the bill, in this case, the broadcasters, then put up their lobbying operation to stop members from supporting that bill. What's happened here in the past, and I said history is really the reason it hasn't been done, is that the broadcasters are a very, very powerful lobbying organization. There are broadcasting towers in every member of Congress's districts around the country. How do those members of Congress get elected to Congress? They go home, they run ads on local radio. So it's a very close relationship that broadcasters have with their local legislator. So it's really difficult when they finally get elected and their ads are listened to and they come to Washington and they're sitting in their offices, and the broadcasting, lobbyists have lots of tools at their disposal. They're a very well-funded lobbying organization here in the United States. They're highly regulated. They have to have pretty large shops here in DC. So now they're elected. The broadcasters come into their office and say, "You don't want to pass this bill. Come on, I'm going to go out of business. This is going to make me pay money I wasn't paying before. I already have to pay the writers. Why should I have to pay the guy that sings the song? I'm already paying the guy that writes the song." And so that cozy relationship that was born out of their hometown business, and perhaps in many cases, there's their friends from a lot of these congressional districts, has been so strong. It's a very formidable opponent in the broadcasting industry, and the music industry just doesn't have that breadth of coverage. To be truthful, I mean, we're an industry that's located in major cities, New York, LA, Austin, Texas, Miami, Nashville, Tennessee. Those are the music centers here in the United States. We don't have a person necessarily that is as loud as a broadcast tower in every single congressional district that can get that word out there. So in my whole career, I've had hundreds of legislators say to me, "I know that this is the right thing to do, but I just don't want to take on my local broadcaster." And the broadcasters do a really stellar job of making sure that those relationships exist with all those members, and they're really, they've got political action money, they've got these local relationships with the business partners back home. So it just hasn't happened. It's really hard to get anything passed in the United States Congress right now, and has been for a while. And it's really hard to get it passed when you've got a formidable opponent that's out there, putting up all their forces to stop something.
Well, I can see that's difficult.
Was that enough lobbying 101?
I think that was brilliant. It's just important, I think, for the music industry to understand that sometimes when we think changes should happen, and they should happen, if you look at fairness, it doesn't mean that they will and can happen. And that's just sort of the reality of, I think, any industry, but something we really need to think about. Just to understand for the listeners, because, laws work differently in different territories. And in UK and in America, a lot of it is built on precedent. Could you just briefly describe to me, what do you mean by precedent?
The precedent of the way things have always been done?
Yeah, the precedent of law, for example, new things being based on precedent of things.
Yeah, like I said, it's really hard to change the way things have been. Just politically, it's difficult. Legally, it's difficult. There's business certainty on the way that things have been set up. In terms of, if you're listening to an earnings call, for example, of somebody in the broadcast industry, they'll have to warn their investors that there could be this new risk to their business, that they would have to pay a fair royalty to the people that create the core product of their business. Needless to say, that's just not something they've had to pay yet. So when broadcasters, get on their earnings calls and explain what possible risks are, they have to highlight this as one of them, because there is pending legislation that could pass and that could make these changes to their bottom line. But it's just always hard to change that. And business certainty is something that you'll hear argued on Capitol Hill every day of the week when people are talking about making a change to a law or a regulation to differ operations from how they've been all along, particularly with a long history of an industry like broadcasting that's really never had to pay this particular performance right. I know that they do around the world. Radio stations are not going out of business around the world. They pay the singer and they pay the writer, and everybody is happy and it's fair. But that's just it's very difficult. And as you know, because that right doesn't exist here in the United States, that does affect collections around the world. There's a debate going on in Europe right now about there's a court case, the RAP case that came out of Ireland, that basically would allow for the collection of those royalties But because that doesn't exist in the United States, Europeans are upset that somehow European money is going out to U.S. artists, because they'd be treated as they were Europeans. And that right doesn't exist here in the United States. And that's the first thing that people always point to. Well, if the United States artists really want this, then why don't they just pass the law in their own country? It's a global problem that's becoming even more prevalent and current, because that law does not exist here in the States.
Yeah. Do you know if there's similar issues in the music industry that can sort of be compared to the unfairness of this? Like other things that just haven't come through yet?
Yeah, there's just kind of the constant ongoing growing pains that the industry is having because of the digital transition. And while we think that, my kids certainly can understand what it would be like to listen to music in the analog fashion, they only know that there is a digital way to get a song instantaneously on demand. That wasn't always the case, and it hasn't been that long. I mean, I started, my career in the music industry in 2003. We were just starting to understand, and unfortunately, we were starting to understand because of the illegal opportunities that people were doing, pirating people's work. But the industry eventually caught up and came up with legitimate alternatives that fans and consumers did want to pay for. But it hasn't been around that long. So there's just constant growing pains. And every time a new service comes on the scene, we need to think about, what are the fair ways to make sure that artists and rights owners get paid across the board for their work. So there's opportunity there, of course, if you're an entrepreneur, to think creatively about, is there a better way to make sure that there's fairness across the board. But there's constant debates. The writers and publishers are always working on the publishing rates that are paid for interactive services, digital services. So I think that there's a lot of other similar debates where artists and rights are saying this just isn't fair. The new model is not catching up to the old model, and that's okay. But they want to make sure that there's fairness across the board in the new model, to make sure that the rates are set fairly, that the structure is set up so that there's equal voices at the table for who's deciding what those rates are going to be. So there's a lot of comparisons that you could make, not necessarily one-to-one where somebody's just absolutely out using work that you are not allowed to withhold. That's basically the biggest difference with that debate and the interactive services. I mean, you'll remember 2 times Taylor Swift has been able to hold back her music from services which she doesn't think that they're acting fairly. One was Apple Music, when they had those free promotions. She said that you can have all the free promotions you want, but you have to pay the rights owners that created the work while you're giving away your product for free. And the other was Spotify. Of course, she had a very high profile issue with Spotify where she was able to hold back her music. In the context of terrestrial radio here in the United States, artists can't do that. If it's out there commercially available, then terrestrial radio can use it without permission.
One of the things that you touch upon, I assume, is sort of the debate around the distribution of master rights versus publishing for DSPs. That's one of the very active debates happening. Another debate also with that is sort of artist-centric payments for streaming services. And nevertheless, what kind of topic it is, there's a lot of people calling for change. But the similar situation with SoundExchange or terrestrial radio, that is long journeys. How do you see these things developing? Like if there were to be a debate around the share of master rights and publishing rights changing, how does that go about?
Well, as with any, and it will be a long journey, like you said, so I definitely agree with you there. But as with any type of exercise that does have a legislative component, that there ever were to be a legislative change or even a regulatory change or debate at royalty boards, just keeping that policy debate in play is often what spurs the industries to sit down and come up with a private negotiated solution. The fear that Congress or the government is going to take some action that will affect how that business is done is enough leverage that it really, if it becomes serious enough, will bring the parties to the table and that they'll work that out on their own. Because let's face it, who is better to come up with those solutions than the actual stakeholders that have the skin in the game that are going to be affected? So sometimes people introduce legislation just to create that leverage, just to create that situation where they can sit down at the table and really hammer out an answer. And sometimes you do need the law to come in and take a little piece from each of the parties and make sure that there's a compromise that people can live with. In the case of the Music Modernization Act, most recently, about 5 years ago, that was the case. Everybody kind of came to the table. They put down ideas of what they wanted from the legislators. And then the legislators kind of hammered out a little bit of pain for everybody. Not everybody was perfectly happy at the end of that process, but they were happy enough that they had enough benefit that it was worth it in the long run. Sometimes you don't even need to pass the legislation to do that, depending on the country, depending on the circumstances. Just getting the parties to the table is enough to achieve that in the marketplace.
Because that's one of the positives. I sort of followed on the sidelines with the Music Modernization Act and David Israelite and him being very vocal about what he's doing and stuff. But because that's a positive thing that things can change. For the listeners, could you describe to me what happened with that act?
What happened specifically with what
was
the first title of that act with David Israelite, or just generally? Because there are three pieces of that act, but we talk mostly about the publishing.
Yeah, then you know a lot more than me. Like in the entirety of what happened, what was the positive change that happened?
Yeah. Well, I think as I said, everybody came to the table. The legislators said, we know that we need to modernize this. We know that we're not living in the digital age. What does everybody want? So everybody put their wish list on the table. And, one of the biggest anchors that needed to hold that bill in place was the lack of the mechanical rights here in the United States coming up to speed with the digital age. Harry Fox organization was paying those rights in the old days in the analog world, and it just had not been duplicated to keep that mechanical royalty for songwriters and publishers in the digital age. So the creation of the Mechanical Licensing Collective, very akin to the creation of SoundExchange back in the DMCA. Everybody knew back in the DMCA that there was going to be these digital rights, that people deserved to get paid when their music was played, and that kind of set the stage at that time, which created SoundExchange ultimately. The same thing needed to be done for mechanical licensing here in the United States with the MMA. So I'd say, when you look at the MMA, there's three titles. That title one that created the MLC, that was the bulk of the pages. There were some pages at the end that also did some wonderful thing. They created the right for producers to get paid. In law that said if an artist wants to share their royalties with producers, that producers are entitled to that under federal law, the AMP Act. That was a big piece for producers, obviously. And then the pre-72 piece was in there as well, that pre-72 recordings are entitled to payment regardless of when they were recorded. So there were other parts of the MMA as well, but those that the Mechanical Licensing Collective needed to exist. And if you look at what's happening with the MLC today around, for the collections and distributions that they're doing around the world, they're distributing hundreds of millions of dollars that was, before that, not being recognized in the digital world. But you're right. I mean, David Israelite made a lot of noise about it, but anybody with an interest in that game was very active. But what was really nice, and I'm sure you've heard about this in the last 5 years, is that the industry really did all come together. At the end of the day, everybody kind of gave a little bit of a pound of flesh, but then at the end of the day said, this is as best as we're going to get. One of the concessions that SoundExchange made was, listen, this terrestrial rights for radio is just going to be a poison pill for this bill. And SoundExchange decided at the time to wait for another day to pass that terrestrial broadcasting piece that was not included in the MMA. We say it was left on the cutting room floor because the legislators were like, look, we can get a lot of this done, but we can't get that done. We can't take on the broadcasters. So that's, compromise is the art of of success when people really do decide that they want to have they needed to have legislation to create that organization, and to right a couple of those other wrongs that were still out there in the marketplace as well.
One of the underlying unspoken themes about everything we talk about right now is the lack of fairness towards the creators in general. Like, I love the music industry. I love music, but I also really, really hate the devaluation of the art and the craft that people bring to the industry. Like, musicians, producers, songwriters, artists have been working in the craft for many, many years, and people really get a lot from that. You know, it's culture, it's art that's put out, and it means something to people. But continuously, it's an industry where you will be severely underpaid compared to the value you bring to humanity. What's your viewpoint on that? Like, do you have any things that you use in order to cope with that statement?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, Jacob. I like spent, like I said, I walked away from a very wonderful Fortune 50 company because I felt exactly that at the time we were debating SOPA here in the United States. I don't know if you remember that, the Stop Online Piracy Act. And it was a very high profile debate where big Hollywood versus Silicon Valley. So the two of those big titans were coming to Washington in their private jets and limousines to talk to Congress about that. And I was working for one of those wonderful companies, and I believed that obviously creators deserve to get paid. What I saw was missing was the actual creator sitting at that table. It didn't have a limo or a private jet to get to Capitol Hill with. And so that's, why I took a pretty, kind of scary and bold step in my career to say, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my career to making sure that creators are represented and that their voice is heard. And that was in 2013. How do we change that? Look, I'm trying to do it one student at a time at American University. I teach a class called Protecting the Creative Class. And it's interesting. We started the class calling it Protecting the Creative Class. And then once we got into it for like the last 6 or 7 years, I was like, we don't need the word protecting. They don't need to be protected. They just need to be championed, but they don't need to be protected. I will say, with the threat of AI coming onto the scene, I actually think that the term protecting the creative class is actually fair game right now. We should probably stick with that title because there are some threats that are coming to the creative class through AI, and we could talk about that if you want to. But in terms of making sure that value of that craft and the importance to the world's economy, to the world's culture, to individual sanity that music gets from those creators is so pivotally important. And I will leave this earth shouting from the hilltops that is the most important thing that needs to be valued fairly, and people need to be compensated for that work, and that artists should be able to do that work as a full-time job. They shouldn't have to be waiting tables or pumping gas or driving Ubers to the modern day equivalent to be able to be an artist. That the systems should be set up with public funds, with private partnerships where artists can do their work full time and practice their craft and make those contributions to society. And like I said, if there are enough of us out there saying that, Jacob, we're on different continents. If we're both shouting it, hopefully we can instill that. And my hope is that in some of my students that are entering the music industry, that they'll go in knowing what a creator looks like, knowing what a creator sounds like, how a photographer makes their living, how a drummer makes their living, and so educating the next generation. So when the next Modernization Act comes up and we're talking about these, that we're sure to represent those writers and performers are represented. I couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, and that's also one of the things that I really want to address over time is exactly that. But one of the key things is over time is going to take time. Sometimes when I talk with my wife, I have 3 kids, and my oldest he's only 4, extremely musical, loves music. Obviously being from the music industry, like I would love for him to be a producer or a singer. But then at the back of my mind, like, would I even allow him to do that? Like when I know the stories, I know the struggles, and for me, that's kind of sad, right? Because this is an industry I love. I love the creation of music, and for my son, I wouldn't even wish upon him that he would go through the struggle almost, eh, because I know that the possibility, even though if he's incredibly talented, the possibility of him actually capitalizing on that is still small. Eh, and I think
Yeah,
that's a sad fact. That's a really sad fact.
absolutely. And on the other end of the spectrum, when you're sending your kids to university, I just sent my youngest, you're going to have to help them think about that. And if they want to be a full-time musician, I don't want to be a parent that has to say, you're going to need a plan B. You're going to need to have another option out there. You can't make music for a living. Like, it's great if you want to do it on the weekends. I want to be able to say to my kid, and I have said this to my kid, we're fortunate enough that I could do that, is like, you go for it. You become whatever you want to become because you're talented, and you got to try it. And then if you get sick of it and decide you want to do something else, you can, but you shouldn't have to go in to start your career by saying, ooh, I got to figure out something that's going to pay the bills. It just shouldn't be that way. It wasn't that way for a long time. I am hopeful and very, very optimistic that with the right people involved and with the right voices saying this, we can create an equitable marketplace for creators. But it's going to be the creators that have to stand up and actually make those points. The lawyers and the lobbyists can do their part, but it really will take the creators, the writers, the singers, those studio musicians you mentioned. They'll take everybody, to really make sure that people know they are out there and deserve to get paid fairly. It's gotten
Right.
a lot better, Jacob, and that's what gives me hope. I feel like the pandemic was a really great education to spotlight this inequity that's out there. That the creators, not only could they not even make living where they could perform out, but when they had to take that to do their own businesses on Zoom rooms and to really appeal to their fans to help support them. I think the word is getting out that you need to have additional support because the current makeup of a lot of the systems is just not set up to create a full-time livelihood for creators.
Hmm. And I also feel like that's generally what's happening in the industry. Like, really, people are tackling it from all different angles. If it's regulation or if it's platforms that focus on fandom and sort of monetizations of the super fans, they're all playing into the fact that no, there's content like monetizing and compensating for people's work. And that makes me more positive. And for me personally, I'm like, I want to be in an industry that looks very attractive years. That's sort of my mental thing. I believe in 15 years, this is going to be a great place to be if everything goes right. And that's why also music entrepreneurship in itself, can, if you look at paper right now and what's happened the last 10 years, it's not necessarily attractive compared to other industries. Like, if you want to be an entrepreneur in the music industry, the valuations of the companies are lower. The possibility of getting financing is harder, and sort of the networking context for building companies is also poorer than many other industries. But I believe that will change in within the next 15 years. And I think that's the good you're doing and many other industry players are doing, is like what we are doing as an industry, the product we are making, music, is inherently worth so much. Now we just need to catch up a bit with actually compensating it accordingly.
The enthusiasm that young people have today is very different than when I was growing up, even when you were growing up, Jacob. And they value what they purchase. So, for example, I know many young people that will go out of their way and spend more on a fair trade cup of coffee because they want to be able to compensate that company for treating their workers right. So there's a value system with young people today that I really believe in my heart, and I agree with you. I think 15 years is a lofty goal, but I think we can do it. For people to value who made what they're enjoying and listening to, whether it's a cup of coffee or whether it's music. I know, and maybe these are just, my students or my own children that, because they hear me screaming this for the last 20 years, but, they value a songwriter. And when you have a songwriter, like Taylor Swift, who's out there kind of showing the world the importance of that craft and valuing that work. That will be the way that this can change when the artists themselves stand up and make those points, and make it clear, like, look what you can do if you're a songwriter. Taylor Swift started writing songs, in her bedroom as well. And I do think that the young audiences today will respect that and work to compensate that, whether it's through, these individual patronage companies that are coming up. I think there's a great opportunity for the entrepreneurs out there to help get money from fans to artists and writers and everybody in the creative chain that will begin to get that value out there. And then, as in terms of the systems that are set up, if you have the artists themselves that want to protect their own craft and really promote those messages, they'll be well received. I have spent enough time and enough pairs of shoes walking Capitol Hill to tell you that they want to hear from the creators themselves. And that's happening. That's happening much, much more than it did, even when I left the corporate world 10 years ago.
Amazingly, that makes me hopeful. And I think it was a really cool transition we made here from neighboring rights, which really stems from, let's call it unfair payment, to fairness in general, because we're both passionate about the same industry. You're a few years ahead of me for doing good work. But we do need people like you, and hopefully like me in the future, that really takes these steps towards having a better industry that is more fair towards creators. With that, Linda, thank you for being on the podcast. Thank you for giving valuable insights about neighboring rights, regulations, fairness, what's happening and what will happen in the future. And I'm confident that even though I'm scared of my son going into the music industry, it will look a lot better when he's grown up than it did when you started in the industry and when I started in the industry.
I sure hope you're right. And I'm willing to fight for the rest of my life to make that possible for your son and for everybody coming up in the future.
Yeah. Thank you, Linda. And thank you for being a son.
Thank you, Jacob. Great job.
Thank you.